All right, good evening, everybody. My name is Jake Brennan. We're here to talk about the movie Kite Runner. It's a 2007 movie based on the novel by the same name by an Afghan American author named Kahil Hassini. And please excuse my pronunciation. These words and names are not common to me. Let's see, this is a story about a wealthy father and son who live in an affluent life in Afghanistan, and they have to flee in order to survive the Soviet invasion back in the late 1970s. The story follows the son Amir throughout various stages of his life. It begins with his childhood regrets, which is mainly betraying his only servant friend Hassan, uh, and then it goes on to talk about it throughout his early adulthood. The story eventually leads to his temporary return to an unrecognizable hometown, the once thriving city of Kabul, Afghanistan. This is a city that's been completely transformed into despair by decades of war and killing. The purpose of his return is to rescue his recently discovered orphan nephew and return him to California to be integrated into his family. There's three major narratives I'd like to talk about. There's a lot going on in the story, but for the purpose of this presentation, we'll just discuss the three major ones as I saw it. Number one, Afghanistan life in the late 1970s. Number two, transition to America while keeping your Afghanistan traditions. And number three, the current environment and Afghanistan itself. Afghanistan life in the late 1970s. Even though Kabul is thriving, there are many intercultural issues between the different groups. There's clear boundaries in class. The wealthy receive education while the poor do not. They work as servants most of the time. Amir's only friend, Hassan, is actually a servant or the son of a servant who is a longtime member of the family, basically. And Amir basically betrays him eventually. Most boys do not treat the servants well at all, and he kind of falls into this pattern. Even Hassan himself is eventually raped by a well-off boy, and even though Amir has plenty of opportunity to call him out on it, he does not. There's a lot of tensions between the affiliated groups in Afghanistan themselves. There's a couple older boys that actually harass Amir because he's not a Pushtan, which I'm not 100% sure what that is, but it's a social class. Amir's father is actually pretty vocal against the communists in general. I'm assuming they have some pro-communist involvement. And then there's actually invasion of the communists itself in the late 1970s, and they pretty much come down. They chop down all the trees. They turn this beautiful, thriving town into a war-torn, just dismal city. Amir's father then basically packs up Amir, and they sell everything they got. Mainly, they trade in his looks like a 1970 Mustang fastback, good-looking car. They trade it in basically just to get a ride to Pakistan so that they can flee. His father, during this immigration to Pakistan, basically lays his life on the line to save some strangers who appear to be less than well off, and they are forever grateful to him. But even in a time of him fleeing to survive his own son, he was still willing to lay down his life in the name of protecting others, and that's a huge part of their culture. The second point is the transition to America while keeping the Afghani traditions alive. Amir's father has basically gone from riches to poor. He went from being well off, donating money to build orphanages, to just being a poor gas station worker, making money at flea markets, what have you. But he still continues his cultural age boundaries from his Afghanistan culture. He maintains boundaries when dealing with ex-Afghan cultures, the Afghan general, excuse me. He still treats him as if he is a royalty, which in America he just works at a flea market just like he does. Amir has to ask his dying father to arrange a marriage from the general's daughter. He's not allowed to talk to her directly until after her hand has been offered to him. The general also makes Amir feel ashamed because he's writing fictional stories and wanting to write stories as opposed to just writing down Afghan culture or Afghan history, excuse me, for people to hear. Amir's father also shows off before he passes away what type of deep seated hatred they have towards the Russians. One of his doctors, as he's getting looked at on his deathbed, happens to be of Russian descent, and Amir's father basically pushes him away and will not let him examine him, even at his moment of most needing examined by a doctor. And then he is pleased when he finally gets a Middle Eastern doctor to come in and examine him. Still on the lines of transition to America while keeping the traditions, there is a crossover cultural issues all over the place. A couple examples: the soon-to-be wife is shamefully confesses that she once lived with a man, which isn't uncommon in American culture. However, her father then went to that man's house and made her come home. She was over 18, and yet her father still had this kind of influence on her, which isn't really very common for American type cultures. And also, there's a deep debt to family and family friends. Amir is to postpone a book tour because his father's best friend requested his presence back in Pakistan. He did not continue on what a typical American would do with his own personal success. He then postponed his entire life and went back to Pakistan to see what his father's friend wanted. That brings us to our third point, or at least third point when this book was written, is the current environment in Afghanistan. There's lots of interactions between the Muslim cultures. Now, there's more than one group of Muslims interacting here. You have your Muslims and your Muslim extremists. Your Muslims are peaceful people who want to basically reshape Kabul back to what it once was. And then your Taliban, who are your Muslim extremists, who basically are going to kill anybody for too much eye contact, clean shaving, that sort of thing. They even publicly stone an adulterer during halftime of a soccer match. They also buy children from orphanages to do God only knows what to. That was part of Amir's culture. He will repay the debt to the childhood friend that he betrayed by going back into Afghanistan and rescuing him. Only once in Pakistan does he realize that that boy is his nephew, and finds out that the friend that he betrayed so many years ago is actually his half brother. Now, once in Afghanistan, he realizes the extremity of the Muslim culture clashing, where the Muslim culture is to die to save Afghanistan, and the extremist Muslim culture is to kill to save Afghanistan. Now, the major causes of these issues is not only political but also cultural. On a tribal level, where they blame all the problems on either the Soviet invasion or the Taliban. They were, however, reluctant to blame any other groups for what had happened in Kabul in his absence, which I may think shows a culture clash between the movie writers and the American culture, which they were selling this movie to, because Americans don't want to see where they're blamed. With all the different conflicts within the movie, I don't see a single one that was resolved in a collaborative manner. It was just a series of different groups competing with one another. Amir spent the majority of his life compromising what he wanted for the traditions of the group that demanded his respect and favorable actions. This is pretty typical of a collectivist culture. It wasn't until he himself became the dominant voice did he find happiness. But this happiness came at the expense of his elders' traditions. He was continuing the cultural tradition of demanding values, albeit the more modern set of values. In the end, there was still no collaboration. Overall, this movie really brings home a feeling of empathy for Amir. Even though he made some major mistakes as a young boy, who doesn't? He appears to be on the path to success in America. He has a wife, though culturally arranged, a book tour, and a strong Middle Eastern support system in California. However, due to the cultural ties and traditions of his homeland, he finds himself risking his life for a world that he hadn't known since he was a child. In the end, you'll find yourself torn between appreciating his new success and understanding why some people resent him for not fighting and maintaining his homeland. All in all, the story contains a series of gut-wrenching events that can really shed some light on the situation in Afghanistan and make you appreciate what you have here. Overall, I give this film a 4. However, you'd have to be in a certain mood to fully appreciate it. A series of extremely complex issues through a single viewpoint will always leave far more questions than answered. That's my presentation on the Kite Runner. Thank you for joining me.